Hello, everyone. Welcome to Avaya University's Healing from Childhood Trauma. I'm Andy Anderson, and my partner Ike Allen and I are the founders of Avaya University and Enlightenment Village. Thanks so much for joining us. In this event, we are talking with some really incredible fellow experts. We're talking with doctors, psychologists, therapists, authors, and more about how to help you heal from your experiences of childhood trauma. And today our guest is going to talk about healing from attachment, complex trauma, and developmental trauma, a new approach. So please welcome Dr. Laurence Heller. Hi there.
Hi.
It's good to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here too.
So I want to tell everyone a little bit about you before we dive into questions. So Larry is the founder of the Neuroaffective Relational Model, or Narm, which is a specialized psychobiological approach to working with developmental trauma. This model is presented in the best-selling book, Healing Developmental Trauma: How Early Trauma Affects Self-Regulation, Self-Image, and the Capacity for Relationship, which is currently published in more than 10 languages. Larry speaks several different languages, and for the past 20 years has been conducting seminars in the Narm approach throughout the US, in Europe, and soon to be worldwide. He co-founded the Gestalt Institute in Denver and later the Rocky Mountain Psychotherapy Institute, where he trained hundreds of mental health professionals. So let's dive in. How does your approach differ from, your approach in working with specifically developmental trauma differ from other approaches?
Well, there's a couple of things that are important. One is that NARM is non-regressive. It isn't about going back and reliving old and horrible traumas and the painful traumas that we've experienced. We don't ignore those, but it's not about reliving them and then getting all of the emotions out. It has a different approach, which we'll have the time to talk about more in depth. But that's an important piece. The other thing is it's non-pathologizing. And again, I know you and I will talk about this, but I want to emphasize this for your listeners right now, that I don't look at these dynamics as pathologizing. For example, we're so used to looking at dissociation, which we know is a symptom of trauma, or we're looking at depression as just pathologies. And what I like to help the lay people who are just working on their own trauma, and clinicians understand is that, yeah, of course, when these strategies, these survival strategies, and I'll talk more about those later, but when these survival strategies of disconnection, various kinds of disconnection like depression and dissociation, when they continue long after they're useful, that's when they become pathologies. But in the beginning, the ability to disconnect from our bodies, the ability to disconnect from our emotions saved our lives. And we don't want to reject or condemn or pathologize any of those kinds of things that saved our lives. And as a matter of fact, by understanding and embracing the survival value of those capacities, it's easier to move beyond them and free yourself from those old patterns than if we just look at them as sicknesses or the various ways that we often hold them in our culture these days.
Yeah, like my understanding as I'm learning more in this event is, right, we all have created these coping mechanisms from when the moments, those horrible things may have happened to us. And that was needed in those moments to survive. Exactly like you're saying. It's what we needed to do in order to get out of that scenario and to survive and keep living another day. And so yes, it's a good perception and perspective to look at it that way, as opposed to here's what's wrong with you because of all these things that happened and how you dealt with them. So I love that.
Yeah. The other piece, and I know that you've had some others, but it is also a body-oriented work in the sense that I think most people out there who struggle with trauma know how much that dealing with trauma affects them on an emotional level, a bodily level, and of course on a cognitive level as well. But we include all of these, and in a way that I think is different from some of the other body-based psychotherapies out there. And again, I'll explain that later. And the other thing is that I'll share with your listeners today some basic organizing principles. So that in NARM we hold that despite the seemingly complexity of human symptoms, that really there are only 5 basic themes that we're all dealing with, variations on these themes, and everybody is different, of course, but it helps to understand what these 5 basic themes are as a way of freeing yourself from these painful patterns that individuals who are coping with trauma have all dealt with.
Got it. So can we dive into, I know you talk about 4 pillars of Narm. So could you tell us what those are?
Well, they're very basic understandings, but somehow often missed. And, it's just really important, like between the therapist and the client, when we're talking about the clinical process, for example, that that we don't just stay symptom oriented. We want to get a sense of what is it that the person who's working on themselves really wants for themselves. And a lot of times until it gets clear for them, most people, and this is normal, are just looking for symptom relief. And many therapies are oriented towards symptom relief. Whereas in Narm, we don't ignore the symptoms, of course, because they're painful, and it's natural that people want to free themselves from symptoms. But often if you focus just on the symptom and not what's really driving the symptom, and I don't mean just the historical pieces, that's important, but also how we continue to regenerate and, basically continue these old coping mechanisms, and how in the present moment, in the here and now, how we're continuing these patterns that and the suffering that goes with those patterns that began in early childhood.
Got it. So, okay. So looking at the underlying patterns, underlying things, and not just the symptoms. So did you, in that, just forgive me if I missed it, but did you talk about the 4 pillars in there? Were they within
the first is just to get a clear understanding of what it is that the person is really wanting.
Okay.
Beyond just symptom relief.
Got it.
We want to know that ultimately what is really helpful for people is to get a sense of what their heart's desire is around this, their dynamic. Obviously, everybody, if they're suffering from depression or they're suffering from anxiety, they want relief from the depression and the anxiety. But underneath that, there is always a deeper wish. Mm-hmm. And what I talk a lot about in Narm, and actually you read, and I appreciate you reading the title of my book, but the original title, which the publishers made me change because they said the title wasn't Googleable, but the original title was Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. And that in a certain way sums up what those people who are survivors of childhood developmental trauma of various kinds are dealing with, is that as human beings, we long to be connected with ourselves. We long to be connected in relationship with other people. For many people, there's a longing to feel connected to something greater than themselves. And so it's a very deep, deep longing. But one we have adapted to childhood trauma by disconnecting from parts of ourselves. It is also frightening and pain, and can be painful, particularly if it's not handled correctly, to reconnect to ourselves. So we want it and we're afraid of it. And I help people, to work through that dilemma for themselves. And so and so we're always tracking in the here and now in the therapeutic process, the connection-disconnection process. And it's a useful thing for people listening who are not therapists to pay attention to that in themselves. Just when they disconnect from themselves, and then just to be curious, what is it that's going on with me that all of a sudden I'm finding myself shutting down? I'm disconnecting from my emotions, or I'm disconnecting from my body. So we're tracking and helping people become more mindful of the connection-disconnection process in their own lives, in their relationships, in every relationship, intimate relationships with friends, coworkers, children, because different dynamics come up in all these different situations.
Hi there, this is Ike Allen, founder of Avaya. I wanted to take a moment and pause the masterclass to remind you that you can experience many more teachers in the free masterclass at avaya.com/healing. That's AVAIYA.com/healing. If you're not currently subscribed for the masterclass, please do so now so you can experience all the available classes in this exciting series. And now, back to the masterclass.
The connection piece is so important. And is there something that you can share with people watching right now about how to catch, right, when you're disconnecting, especially from yourself, right? How do people even know that they're disconnecting from themselves?
Well, one way to know is when you're feeling tension. Because tension is the physiological mechanism of the body to disconnect. And so when we're tightening our jaws, or we've got a knot in our stomach, or tension in our shoulders, the various kinds of symptoms that are very common for people, to understand that in that we are disconnecting. Now, that doesn't mean that just by being aware of it, it can automatically change. But then we can begin to inquire, what is it that's really going on? What am I really feeling? Because sometimes the tension itself becomes the focus, because it is painful and it's hard to deal with. But then people miss the underlying emotional dynamics and even the identity dynamics that are going on that are driving the tension. Now, there's another element to it too. There's tension in the body and there's collapse. And that's, like dissociation and depression have more to do with collapse. Anxiety has more to do with tension, stress, and stress in the obvious way of being stressed out.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That's helpful.
So that's the second pillar has to do with this certain kind of inquiry. Like really being, not trying to just solve problems or fix symptoms, but to really get a sense of what is it that's really going on for me. The third part, the third pillar, which is also very important, is to ask ourselves, in any kind of emotionally challenging situation, what is our part in this? Not to blame ourselves, because blaming ourselves is not the same thing. And the third pillar has to do with what I call in Narm agency. I don't use the word responsibility because that has elements of blame, and we blame ourselves enough as it is. But agency, to see, that as adults, we have a part in our own difficulties. And just to give you kind of you and the listeners an everyday example of what I mean, is like, it's so common, couples come into therapy and they're experiencing difficulties, various kinds of symptoms in their relationships. They're fighting and, the kinds of things that couples do. But at the beginning of the therapeutic process, it's so common that each is wanting to point the finger at the other, and they're often very good at seeing the other person's faults and the other person's shortcomings and that kind of thing.
Yep.
To just stay in this position of blaming the other or a situation for what's going on in you is not coming from a place of agency. So in a non-blaming way in Narm, we help people see what is their part. So they feel rejection, for example. It isn't just rejection. It's what they do with the rejection that becomes important. It's like very commonly when people experience rejection, or even real or imaginary, a coworker doesn't talk to them and they feel really hurt, and then they start rejecting themselves. That's where the agency piece, that's the third pillar. Like, what do you do with the various kinds of relationships and, the various kinds of circumstances, particularly the difficult emotional circumstances that you find yourself in? What is your part in that? Again, without blame, I keep emphasizing that. And it's amazing how liberating it is to see, for example, what we're doing, what our part of it is, that it's not just the rejection from the other that we're so upset about, but we start then rejecting ourselves. We say, oh, it must be the way I'm not tall enough. I'm too tall, or something's wrong with my nose or my thighs or my ears, or there's human beings have a whole wide range of things that they start rejecting themselves about. And so in Narm, I bring this piece in about what it is that we do to ourselves and how we continue. None of us started these dynamics. These dynamics started as ways to protect ourselves, but we continue to reject ourselves and be hard on ourselves and be critical of ourselves long after we get out of the original traumatizing circumstances or situation. So that's the third pillar. And the fourth pillar has to do with really paying not just attention to everything that's gone wrong and going wrong, but also to notice those moments when we're feeling really connected, when we're feeling more like ourselves, when we're, more in touch with what, with who we authentically are. And to notice, what is it that's going on internally, the agency there. How am I supporting myself in that way? What is it that's going on externally that's helping me to find that increased connection in myself? And so these are the four basic pillars.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Then there's, without kind of getting into too long of a monologue here, then in the book I talk about 5 basic survival styles. And these survival styles develop at different stages of life. They're chronological in terms of development. So I talk about connection, attunement, trust, autonomy, and love sexuality. Those that all of the things that we as human beings deal with in some way or another come back to one or more of these basic what I call organizing principles. And that makes what we're struggling with as human beings easier to deal with, and brings more understanding to see that, like when we've had very, very early trauma, the first year of life, let's say, it's, again, that's why I call that the earliest survival style, the connection survival style. So like all human beings, we're hardwired to be social animals, to be engaged, to have, to be in touch with our emotions and our body. But when we've had the earliest kinds of trauma, prenatal trauma, birth trauma, early attachment trauma, where there isn't a solid connection between, parents and child, is that we learn to disconnect. We learn to disconnect from our body. We learn to disconnect from our emotions. We learn to disconnect from other human beings. We go to our room, we read books, we daydream, we create our own little world, and it feels safe in there. And we do those things as a way of coping. But then this process of disconnection from body and from emotions and other people gets so automatic that we continue that process. And at the same time, this is the original title of the book, as human beings, it's our deepest longing to be connected to something, to something greater.
Right.
This is the basic dilemma that we're dealing with. Now, I won't go as long on the other ones, but then I have attunement, which is that when our needs weren't attuned to effectively by our caregiver, usually the parents, but different people grow up in different situations, is that we don't develop the capacity then to attune to our own needs.
Right.
And often, and then we develop ideas about ourselves, like that we're not even deserving of having our needs met. And we get so good at not focusing on our needs that we don't even know anymore what it is that we're really needing. And then we develop these strategies, that, again, different systems have given names, but we develop these strategies. Many people with the attunement survival style are experts in attuning to other people's needs,
right,
and not their own. And so this is, again, a coping mechanism. Often they learn to do that as children because it helped them. It was safer. They focused on everybody around them, and it created some kind of sense of safety.
Right.
So it's just, again, it's learning how to attune to ourselves in a way that maybe we never were attuned to as children.
Right.
So then, very briefly again, and trust is just being able to, that there is such a thing as healthy dependency or healthy interdependency, to learn that we don't have to do everything ourselves. We can let down, we can trust other people appropriately. I mean, not everybody can be trusted, of course, but we learn how to discern, because people who are strongly struggling with trust issues don't know who they can trust and who they can't. Sometimes they trust people they shouldn't, but they often don't trust people who they actually can, and they don't let people close to them. Then the fourth organizing principle is autonomy. And that has to do with developing really a healthy autonomy, which is, again, a hardwired dynamic in children. At a certain age, every child wants to start feeding him or herself, and they want to start tying their own shoes. And every step that the child starts to take is ultimately a step away from the parents. And if the parents have their own issues about that, they get in the way of the child's developing independence. They need, they feel like they're being abandoned by the child. This is not an uncommon dynamic, for example. Then they communicate that to the child, and then the child doesn't feel safe in establishing his or her own autonomy, and they continue that. And then that has so many symptoms. They don't say no when they really mean no. They have a hard time setting limits in general with people. They often let themselves be used as doormats. There's a whole, range of things, of symptoms and challenges that individuals with the autonomy survival style have.
Mm-hmm.
And the last organizing principle is the love sexuality survival style, which has to do with being able to be, have an open heart in intimate relationships, to be in touch with your vital sexuality. And for this survival style, which is the only one that has two names, it's actually love sexuality. In other words, it actually has to do with integrating the capacity to be loving, open-hearted, and at the same time to be in touch with a healthy sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you.
And all these things get affected by developmental trauma.
Right. I can imagine. I was like thinking about all the different things that can come out of that. Like the one, I think it maybe was the second one you talked about around, like it reminded me of people pleasing, right? Becoming someone who's a people pleaser and codependency and all the things that come out of that because you're, trying to make everybody happy as a child, and then you forget about yourself and all your attunement, right? That was attuning to your needs.
Yeah. So. Not sometimes the autonomy survival style can also be a people pleaser in a different way. The attunement tend to be the caregivers, so enablers and codependency. The autonomy survival style, they can also get into that to some degree, but they just have a hard time saying no when they mean no. So it's slightly, and of course, many people have combinations of both, of several different survival styles.
Right. Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing the pillars of Narm and these 5 survival strategies. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the body. So you've touched on it here and there amidst this class so far, but tell us a little bit more about the role of the body in your approach.
Well, one of the things that differs between working with shock trauma and developmental trauma is shock trauma tends to be more often a single event. It could be, a car accident or a fall and various kinds of things. But part of the challenge with developmental trauma is what we call chronicity. In other words, it's something that isn't just, a single event. It goes on day after day, month after month, year after year. It may be big things like abuse and neglect, but it can also be smaller things, seemingly smaller things. They're not small to a child, like misattunement, like a sense that the child doesn't really exist as a separate human being for their parents. Like, so that the parent may be, feed them and not beat them. And, they're not, on the surface, they can look like great parents, but on some deeper level, they see their child as just an extension of themselves. And so they don't acknowledge the child's separateness. They're not supportive of the child's separation, individuation from the parent. Everything, it's like they believe that they know always what's best for the child. They don't give the child age-appropriate autonomy. And so all of these elements come into play, and the being in this chronically stressful situation that can sometimes start pre-birth, continue at birth, shortly after birth, but can continue all through a person's childhood, is that we're living with chronic levels of stress. And this, and we understand a lot more about stress than we did even 20 years ago. But this stress response that people experience with developmental trauma becomes chronic, and it becomes self-generated. That's part of the challenge that people out there with chronic, who are dealing with their own traumatic history, is that we continue. There's the agency piece that I mentioned, is that we continue to generate stress about so many things that are not objectively as stressful as we perceive them, because it taps into what's already in us, the sense of foreboding, the sense of dread, the sense of, upcoming catastrophe in one way or another. And this creates chronic stress, and this chronic stress obviously has a profound impact on every system of the body. So it affects, I mentioned tension and collapse, so it affects our neural, musculoskeletal system, for example, but it affects us on a hormonal level. So we're constantly pumping out adrenaline, for example, which, and that it affects our nervous system, because that adrenaline is also associated with high levels of arousal in the nervous system. So we've got anxiety, and we're, and that can even be panic attacks. All kinds of things can come out of these high levels of arousal. So the body is really the vehicle that carries the trauma, as I'm sure so many people know. And so then people started getting chronic kinds of difficulties when you think about how stress, if it doesn't get resolved, and it accumulates over time. And so it's not surprising that we see so many people with trauma having things like irritable bowel syndrome, and just stomach problems in general, or chronic neck problems because of the tension in the muscular system, or they're just chronic headaches. Again, the tension headaches that can be caused by stress and tension. And I just like to include that dynamic in our understanding about how this develops over time and how we keep carrying it forward as adults.
Hi, it's Ike again. I wanted to remind you once more that you can experience many more teachers in our free masterclass at avaya.com/healing. That's avaya.com/healing. If you're not currently subscribed for the masterclass, please do so now so you can experience all the available classes in this exciting series. And now, back to the masterclass.
Gosh, that's amazing right there. I mean, I know this, and so many people probably watching right now know this, but the way you said it, right? Like, if we grew up in this chronic state of stress and anxiety and whatever trauma and things happening to us, like, we can literally carry it with us and self-generate. There it is. We continue to keep that cycle going and self-generate. So something that is seemingly might not be a big deal to someone who did not have that history or that childhood, right, would see a situation differently, and we might see it as catastrophic or thinking the worst about things. So there it is.
And that's exactly just as you said. That's exactly what happens.
Yes.
If you haven't had that trauma, you can look, there could be a situation, it might be even a challenging situation, but it doesn't take on these catastrophic proportions that it does for somebody who's got unresolved trauma and the survival styles that developed out of that.
So, okay, so you touched on this a little bit in the beginning. How do you work with a person's history in the now, in the present moment? How do you do that?
Well, one of the things that I talk about when I teach therapists is that we're not in the business of going on archaeological expeditions. We don't have to go to the past. We start with who a person is now, what it is that they're actually dealing with in their lives. And then we start to look at what is their part in it, again, without blame. And the interesting thing that happens is that we're tracking how people disconnect constantly. This is a process that is going on, this disconnection dynamic. And we're working with that in the therapeutic process. And the interesting thing that happens is that as people become aware of their patterns of disconnection, then, and in the process, we start to get more connected. Whatever is unresolved from the past will come up. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule. It depends on the person. So if somebody has never addressed anything about their history, then of course we need to talk about their history and go with that. But we also want to see, well, what was it that you've taken out of these difficult situations as a child and that you're carrying forward? That's the agency piece. So I'm not saying we never go to history, but we want to really, the various kinds of dilemmas that we grew up with tend to express themselves more clearly in relationships as adults than just talking about how it was with our parents. Our parents, if we're now 30 or 40, our parents are now in their 70s, or, they're not the same people that they were when we were children, and we are no longer children anymore. So I don't work with the so-called inner child, for example. I work with what I call child consciousness, which is different. I don't like people to get the idea that there's actually this inner child in there. there is a child's way of viewing the world that we all are stuck in to one degree or another. But I try to help people see that what we often just put a label on and make it into a noun is actually a process. So, so the inner child is one of those things. But another one is just like this very common thing about burnout. It's people talk about burnout, but that's just a word. And so in the language of agency that I use in Narm, I would ask that person, so how did you burn yourself out in your last job? And then we start looking at the dynamics. Well, they were people pleasers to begin with, so they wanted to please everybody. They started driving themselves sometimes mercilessly to do more than their body could handle, I could go on and on about that just with burnout, but just to see that it's not just a noun, it was a process. And once they can see their part in it, it isn't just that you may have had a terrible boss and you may have had difficult coworkers, but there's still this part of agency of what it is that we did with all that and how we burned ourselves out in that context. And that actually helps us feel more like adults and less like helpless children.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally get that. Yeah. What are exactly agency? And I love the word too. I think that's a very powerful, empowering context to look at our role in it. Like, did we get enough sleep when we were in that scenario? Were we staying up too late? Were we not getting, whatever, healthy exercise or eating well or, all those, that's my background. So I always go to that, right? What did I go to my yoga classes or did I skip them all? And, it's important to, take a look at, yes, our role in it. So I think that's so key.
I mean, an example that we've seen so many times, but take a celebrity performer, and particularly like somebody, singers and various, how many times have we read about they collapsed either right before they went on stage or on stage, or that they're suffering from exhaustion or burnout. Yeah. But here are people who have more money than they'll ever need in their entire lives. So it's not a practical issue that they're having to put bread on the table for their family. It's just they have this, but they drive themselves. They have other people around them driving them too because they're making money from them, but they don't listen to their bodies. They don't listen to their emotions. They keep performing even though their body is exhausted. And finally, the body gives out, and then they start drinking or doing drugs or the various kinds of things that we see so commonly in every movie about, music stars that we see. It's almost always the same story. And it comes from not really listening to yourself, not really attuning to what your body needs, what you're needing emotionally, what's right for you, not at the expense of others, but just what's right for you, to be mindful of that.
Right. Exactly. Awesome. Thank you. So let's go into also your approach. You mentioned at the beginning is non-regressive, and we kind of talked a little bit about that, but it's also non-cathartic, I believe. So what does that mean?
Well, there are some systems out there, and maybe more in the past, but there are still systems out there that believe that it's essential that people relive their traumatic experiences. And I don't agree with that. I think there are some people who are integrated enough that they can do that, they can relive it, and they can actually get some relief. But so often it's actually creates more trauma rather than resolving the trauma. So I talk about renegotiating the trauma but not reliving it. It's non-regressive in the sense that we don't want to reinforce the sense that we're a child in an adult world. We want to have compassion for what some people call the inner child, but that younger version of ourselves. We need to develop compassion, and we need to develop attunement, and many of the things that we didn't get growing up. But we don't want to regress and relive and feel like we're a child again. Most of us in various degrees are already regressed enough,
right.
And so really I tend to work more with the inner adult than the inner child. I don't want people to get the idea that I ignore that so-called inner child, but to help people really start to see the world more, like these various survival styles and organizing principles. I talk about them as lenses that we put over our eyes, and then we tend to filter information that comes our way. So anything that fits with how we already see the world, we take in, and anything that doesn't fit with how we've come to see ourselves in the world, we reject. And this is just a human dynamic. But part of the Narm work then is not so much just regressing to the past, but seeing how we put on various filters in the past and we're still carrying those forward. For example, a child cannot experience him or herself as a good person in a bad situation. So anything that goes wrong in the environment, and the younger the child is, the truer this is, but anything that goes wrong in a child's environment, they take as something wrong with them. Right. A child can't say, I'm just curious why my parents aren't loving me. I guess they just don't have the capacity. There must be something wrong with their ability to love.
Right.
Obviously, children don't think that way. They don't feel love in the various ways that it's communicated, parent to child, and they think there's something wrong with me. I'm not lovable. I'm defective in some way or another. And then we carry this distorted identity forward, and we develop shame, and we develop self-hatred, self-judgment. And again, we carry these dynamics forward. So often when I begin the therapeutic process with somebody, very quickly they present the opportunity to me to begin to address their self-hatred and their self-judgment and their self-criticalness in various forms it takes with different people. And see, that's how, and there when we start to see that we're doing that to ourselves right now, then we can look at, the roots of that and see, I did that because as a child, we didn't understand any better. If we regress a person back to the child, it takes us back to the same level of understanding that we had then too often. Now, it doesn't always happen that way. Some regressive work has, of course, helped people, but I'm saying it's a more consistent and a higher degree of success when we are not into regressing people in the therapeutic process.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you diving into that. And it might be different than some other people have experienced in other classes or any number of things, but obviously everybody just needs to figure out what's going to work best for them and go on that journey. So we're running a little low on time, Larry, but I want to make sure you get to talk about your free gift and your offer. But first, will you just explain a little bit about your training program and your online program? So what are those things?
We've got trainings all over the US. We've got trainings in Western and Eastern Europe. We've got trainings that will be beginning in other parts of the world too, in Asia and Australia and so on in the next couple of years. And we also have an online training program. The online training program is geared more towards clinicians, but we have many people who are not clinicians who find it valuable because we go into the nuts and bolts of healing work, and there's demonstrations of sessions, and we take them apart and help people to understand what it is that was going on here, why we did what we did, what it is that we were seeing and understanding. And so the feedback that I've gotten from both clinicians and non-clinicians is they found it very useful in understanding their own process. Because even if you're a clinician, most clinicians also have their own traumas to deal with. And it helps us understand, our process better, and gives me and one of my teachers, Brad Kammer, who does these seminars with me online, it gives us the opportunity to teach these principles that I'm, in 45 minutes, that we just have the opportunity to touch on and to go into depth and give examples and to see other people who are dealing with similar kinds of struggles and how they can get some kind of resolution. Even sometimes in the course of a single session. Usually a single session is not enough, but a lot of important things can happen in a single session. So they get to view sessions, they get to view various other kinds of materials. There's a webinar on a particular subject every month. So we talk about shame and guilt. We talk about, you know, when people have more severe diagnoses, what are the implications of that? So we have a different topic every 4 weeks.
Got it.
And then for clinicians out there, and these training programs, like in the U.S. and Europe, are for clinicians who want to advance their skills, who want to learn the Narm approach. We've got a 2-year training program, a certain number of days per year that they can do and attend live. And for those clinicians who are interested, we have a certification program. And so all of that's possible.
Got it. Yes, something for everybody watching right now, whether you're a clinician or you're not, and you're just, wanting to heal from your own childhood trauma. It sounds like you have a lot to offer. So there's 2 buttons below this video right now, everyone watching. One takes you over to a free gift that Larry has for you, and the other, I think, is to this online program where you have a free trial.
Yeah, there's a 2-week free trial, so you don't have anything to lose. You can see if it's helpful to you, if it's interesting to you. You can, and the resources that we've developed, many of them, we keep at least the last 3 months, so you have they're archived, and so you can review some of the things that have already been done. And there's always different events going on that you can participate in for that 2-week period at no cost.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for offering that. So yes, everybody, button right below. So if you want to go ahead and join in on that free couple of weeks and see what, how you want to move forward. Awesome. And thank you for offering that to everyone.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
And so the free gift, I think, is an excerpt from your Adaptive Survival Styles Manual. So is that what you were talking about, those 5 survival styles?
Yeah, it's the first part of the manual where I just scope out again in greater detail some of the things that you and I have started to talk to, and some of that material is also in the book, which is available. The Healing Developmental Trauma book, which is available for those people interested, and it's also available in book form. It's available in different languages, as you mentioned, and it's also available in ebook form. So it's people can download it if they're interested.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for all of that, Larry. Are there any last insights you want to leave everyone with before we wrap up?
Yeah, there's a lot of people out, it's never been easy to be a human being, but when you grow up in traumatic situations, it's even that much more difficult. And one of the things that we know from neuroscience these days is that the brain, and by extension, the nervous system and the whole body, is much more plastic than we have ever understood. It used to be felt that trauma was a life sentence. And my last message to people is out there is that all of these difficult patterns, or a big percentage at least of these difficult patterns that you're struggling with, can be changed. The brain is plastic. We as adults and adult human beings have the capacity for change in ways that are often surprising to people. So there is hope, always.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Awesome last words. And thank you so much for all the work that you do for people, for clinicians, and everybody in the world. And we really appreciate you being on today.
Yeah, well, thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into Larry's class. And here, once again, is to your journey to healing from childhood trauma. Bye, everybody. Hey, everyone. I just wrapped up another great class with Dr. Laurence Heller, and he talked with us about healing from attachment, complex trauma, and developmental trauma, a new approach. I really enjoy this talk. He is up to really amazing work in the world for people, for clinicians, and I thought his approach was really amazing. So a couple of the things I wanted to talk about was disconnection. So he really stressed that people that have dealt with childhood trauma often have struggles with disconnecting from themselves, disconnecting from other people in their life, even people that they would otherwise trust. We often disconnect, right? So I asked him, how do we know? How do we know when we're disconnecting specifically from ourselves? How do we become aware of this? And he mentioned tension. So if you're somebody, he related this to, being anxious and having a lot of anxiety in our lives. So if you're someone who who gets anxious a lot, he was saying this is a sign of us disconnecting from ourselves. And oftentimes we focus on that tension, right? That stress, that feeling inside of our body, and miss what's underneath it. Miss why it is that we're feeling that tension, miss whatever happened to us in the past that we've brought with us into our present, and we focus instead on that tension. So I thought that was really key, and just something to become aware of in yourself, to try to recognize when you're disconnecting from yourself, whether that's disconnecting from emotions that you're feeling, or memories, or things that you want, things that you need that you haven't become attuned to in your life. Oftentimes we cover that up and recognize it as this thing called tension. Another thing he mentioned was really common for people who have struggled with trauma as a child is collapse, right? And this is related a lot to depression. So these are just things to be aware of in your life and your journey as you become more aware of how childhood trauma has affected you in your life and what you can do about it today. So another thing that he talked about, and he heavily stresses the role of the body in healing from childhood trauma, because obviously just like disconnecting from our bodies, why is it that we're doing that? Well, because in the past, right, that was a coping mechanism to get through, to survive whatever traumatic thing was happening to us at the time. So it makes sense that we learn to disconnect from our bodies, right? So the thing that he mentioned that I thought was just really interesting is if you have chronic stress in your life as a child, right? This is a developmental trauma. It becomes this chronic thing that happened over and over and over again. And then because our bodies we're so used to experiencing that chronic stress in life, we self-generate that in our lives as adults. So as hard as this might be to hear, maybe this is something new that you've never really thought about before. This is so important. And this is that piece called agency he was talking about, right? What is our role in self-generating, right, stressors and things happening in our life now? So just take a look at your life without blaming, like he mentioned, and what is your role in continuing this trauma in your life, continuing these stresses in your life? How are you playing a role in that? Just taking a look at it from a curious angle of self-compassion and love towards yourself, and, just becoming aware of that. So I thought that was really powerful. He called it agency. So please, if you're interested in working further with Dr. Heller, he has a free gift. He has a great free trial for his membership, and he also has a book, and we have links to all of that stuff below. So please take a look at those if you're interested. And thank you so much once again for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye, everybody.